My name is Philip McDaniel. I am a librarian here at UNC-Chapel Hill and one of the members of the conference committee. And the session that you are attending right now, this is the session by Melissa Hyland and Aaron Kirschenfeld of also of UNC-Chapel Hill. And the title of the session is Enhanced Connection, Research Instruction in the Remote Environment. So the way that we'll do this today is we're going to ask that everybody remain muted unless you have a question to ask. Melissa and Aaron are going to have a dynamic presentation, so they'll allow Q&A as it's going along. We'll also have a Q&A at the end. The session is being recorded, so any questions that you ask, your name will be identified in the recording and in the transcript. I'll also mention that the live captioning is going to be enabled for this. So if you do want to hide that from the presentation, you can do that from the menu at the bottom. And I'll be handling questions by chat as this goes along. So feel free to send them along and we'll answer those, get those answered as they go. So so thanks everybody for attending, and I'll now turn it over to Melissa and Aaron.
Thank you so much. And, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for joining us for this session this morning. I am obviously Melissa Hyland. I am the Reference and Faculty Research Services Librarian over at the UNC School of Law Library. And Aaron, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name's Aaron. I'm the Digital Initiatives Law Librarian and also a clinical associate professor of law at the law school. We're hoping to chat today in I hope an interactive manner with you all. So you came into these rooms or into this room muted. You may unmute yourself if you have a question at any time, or if you want to participate. So we will try to, in the spirit of fostering an enhanced connection, keep this pretty free flowing and hopefully hit on points that you want to hear about.
Yes, exactly. So no breakout rooms today, we promise. But we do ask that if you have a comment or a thought, again, just feel free to unmute yourself and join the conversation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get the slide deck up. Aaron, look good?
Looks great.
Okay, so just some quick background for our presentation before we get started. So Aaron and I both, as a part of our responsibilities as reference librarians at the law school, we get to teach a standalone 3-hour credit course for law students, and it is advanced legal research. So it's right up our alley. We teach some of the, all of the many advanced sort of legal research skills that the attorneys will need when they're in practice. And this past semester, so fall of 2020, we both taught this fully synchronous and online. So this session is really going to focus on our takeaways from our experiences in a 3-hour semester-long course, but we wanted to sort of bring in as well a lot of the sort of single session research classes that many of us as librarians offer to students sort of across our various campuses. So let's go ahead and I'm going to.
So to build on that, I think there's a lot that's applicable to all kinds of instruction that librarians would be doing in a remote environment, and to kind of set our expectations for today, which is setting expectations for an instructional session or for a course is one of those wonderful things that you can do in the remote environment a little bit better, I think, than in the physical environment. But we wanted to focus on 3 things. First, how you foster an interactive classroom environment. Second, how you can build connections with each student, and as I mentioned or alluded to, how you can kind of set course expectations, and perhaps more important, how you can alter how things are going in your class or your sessions, depending on your strengths and weaknesses and what's worked or not worked in the past.
Great. And as you'll see, we try to talk about both sort of the things that we thought went really well, things that went better than expected, but also things that obviously are just a struggle in the online environment. So what we're going to kind of do here is let's kind of brainstorm about what things are normally like, and then we'll talk about some of the changes we noticed when you went to the fully online remote environment. So in thinking about normal interactivity in a classroom setting, we have some sort of conversation prompts. I'll sort of launch us. Aaron, you can jump in as well. And this is where y'all can participate and just sort of share what your experiences have been over the years, actually going into classrooms and providing research instruction. So really, we want to think about what we're used to in the physical classroom setting. So what do we mean when we talk about interactivity in that physical classroom? How does this happen naturally? And what are some of the ways that we actually, as teachers and instructors, foster that kind of environment? I mean, Aaron, I don't know if you want to start with your thoughts on these questions.
Sure. I don't mind getting us started. If it will help others also pitch in. But I think for me, when in the physical environment, all environments, all instructional environments, at least the ones that we've had experience with, are engineered in some kind of way, right? So even interacting on Zoom, this is a software that's engineered to have us interact in a certain way. The physical classroom is engineered in a certain way, or certain different ways to foster or in some cases not foster interactivity. So in our physical classroom that we use, the desks are all in a row. Actually, they're tables that are in a row. The instructor stands at the front of the class, facing the students, and I found that there's some difficulty with getting students to share what they're interested in that kind of environment. But on the other hand, I think the expectation that students bring into this kind of physical classroom setting says, okay, this is a place where you go to learn, right? You enter in through the walls or the doors of the building. You're inside the classroom walls. This is a learning place, right? And I think that's one way that that interactivity happens naturally. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
We've got this silent bunch. I'll just jump in then and just sort of add, when you're getting at the how does this happen naturally, when I think about that, I think about the fact that a lot of students that come to our classes, they're friends, they know each other socially from outside of the classroom. So even just at the beginning, kind of having that natural chatter that happens between the students before class starts. I have always found as an instructor that that's a way for me to kind of get to know them just by sitting there and preparing and just hearing like what they're talking about. They tend to talk about what they're doing, what their interests are, like what interesting things have happened recently in the law school. So it's just a way to kind of get them naturally talking and sort of gear up for class. So when we launch in, it's just sort of a natural segue to, okay, we were talking amongst ourselves and now we're just going to kind of talk, and the professor is going to be included in this conversation. So in my mind, even little things like that, just the students and their knowledge of each other and just sort of physical presence in the room all goes towards creating that interactive environment. But I'm going to go ahead and shift to our next slide.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Melissa. I always find that when I'm standing in front of the room and the students are chatting, that I don't want to break into what they're talking about. It's like I'm wearing the "Hello, fellow kids" T-shirt, but I'm clearly not in the peer group. I'm the one standing in the front of the room, and I think as we're transitioning into talking about what's possible in a Zoom environment, we're all at least the same size. We're all in our little boxes, and we're all on the same level, which I think is something that I've been cognizant of in the physical environment, right? Sage on the stage. There are ways to do share the podium space, share the instructional space. But at least on Zoom, we were together in the sense of being little heads in the screen or being little boxes.
Yeah, and I think that's right. So for this sort of thinking about interactivity then in the Zoom environment, we divided it up into that informal interactivity where in the physical classroom, that would just sort of happen amongst students. But in the Zoom environment, we have to be a little bit more intentional about our informal interactivity. That's a lot of I words. But so a few things that we did that we incorporated into this environment to just sort of create that feeling of community that normally just sort of naturally happens in the physical classroom. Greeting students upon arrival, obviously, it makes sense when you say it. It's something that's really easy to forget to do. But we both, I think, had comments on class reviews, and we had students actually tell us they appreciated hearing their name specifically when they came into the room. It was sort of a way to let them know that we were aware that they were there and that, we were happy to see them. So it actually did make an impact, even though I kind of went the whole semester. I just did it and didn't think about it, and then only realized after the fact that students appreciated that I was doing that. So greeting students upon arrival and non-school chatter. So this is like Aaron said, he doesn't jump into this in the physical classroom. I do. Like if a student is talking about something and I know about that thing, like Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, I will jump in and just say like, oh yeah, what about this? So because that wasn't happening naturally in Zoom, like students just tended to pop into the room and then they just sat there. And there's a few minutes lead time before class starts and it just is kind of awkward. It's this awkward silence. So I would brainstorm things to talk about that were not school related, that were not COVID related, to just kind of get them chatting. And like one example that I'm just going to throw out is while I was teaching, the Dune trailer came out, Frank Herbert's classic sci-fi set of books. The first movie was supposed to come out in the later sort of fall semester. Obviously didn't because of, delays at theaters. But I just threw that out there and I was like, did anyone catch the Dune trailer over the weekend? And then students just immediately started jumping in, like talking about what they thought and, hopes for the movie, like concerns whether it's going to be good. But I would just sort of in my mind and in my back pocket essentially have these little like conversation points just to kind of get students warmed up to talking in the Zoom environment. Because I had an 8:45 a.m. class. Aaron had an evening one, so he might have a different experience there.
Sorry, we've got a chat about how many students we have in our class, and I believe the answer was both 15, or I had 16 and you had 15. Or
I had 15. Yeah. Yep, that's correct.
Which was I thought a pretty good size for this kind of class. Just a further kind of informal point as we move to looking at some more formal ways of fostering interactivity. It just helps students also know that everything's functioning and working, that they are in fact there for class, and that we're getting ready to go. I was. I think I still experienced some of that. Once I pitched into the conversation, all of the students quieted down with their own conversation. What I found worked better for me was having a bit more of a formal structure to fostering interactivity, and I think this worked in the Zoom environment a lot better for me than it does normally in the physical classroom. So one thing that I believe, Melissa, we both did this with on-call groups.
Yes, we did.
We would set a certain number of students who would be on call for the day, meaning that in the absence of waiting 7 to 10 seconds after posing a question, as we did, I'll do it now. It's a long time, but no, you count it out in your own mind. Be okay with the awkwardness, But if no one answered that after that period of time, there would always be a default group of students who would, by virtue of having to participate in the class and a participation score, would be there to contribute to the discussion. We talked a little about those intentional pauses. It's very tough. I don't know who's tried it. I tend to kind of enjoy it a little bit. You do kind of have to make sure that people don't think your video has broken when you're sitting there silently. But other than that, I found that those two tools were good at getting kind of more traditional styles of discussion started.
Yeah, and then I'll just sort of finish off some of the things I sort of incorporated to make sure that there was this interactivity happening both between myself and the students and amongst the class sort of in general. Communication with and through work product. So we normally would do in-class exercises in the physical classroom where students would work together in small groups on sort of a specific prompt that assess the knowledge from the day. And then we come back together and we talk about what they did, what they tried, how it went. So it was sort of a very structured and yet informal way of going through sort of practice exercises. But in the Zoom environment, just to kind of save time and to reduce the stress level on students, because, and we'll get to a slide about breakout rooms, and we both have different theories on these, but my experience is that every time you throw breakout rooms into the equation, people tend to leave the room or not actively participate as you might hope. So what I did instead was allowed students to just work on the practice exercises on their own time. But then I would follow through with commentary on what they were doing. And it really worked out because what ended up happening is that students would start communicating with me through their work product because they knew I was reading it and was sort of notating as I went. So it was an interesting way for me to get to know them individually, just through the conversations we had in their formal assignments, but also in their informal work as well. And then sort of tying into that, demonstrations for difficult tasks. The one thing that I really love about Zoom is the ability to film yourself going through an exercise and then post that video for students to watch. I had many students tell me throughout the semester that if they struggled with something or they weren't sure, they'd put in the notes to their assignment, I'm going to watch the video to see sort of how Professor Hyland does this. So those videos were a really helpful way to create sort of like a semi-permanent record of the skill that we were practicing that day. So students could come back to it at a later time. They could watch it whenever they sort of needed a brush up on a skill. So that really worked great. And then this last one I have, games. Yes, law students are super competitive. It's just sort of in the blood, I guess, of folks who want to go to law school. And I would do games in the physical classroom, sort of like Jeopardy style, where students would like rack up points and the top student would have a chance to win like a cheesy prize. And I didn't know if it would work well in the Zoom environment, but it actually really did. And it was on the days where we played games, like a statutory finding game, where they were the most sort of interactive and excited. They were heavily using chat. And I ended up, just to kind of make it fair, I said, you have to put your answers into chat. And that way, whoever posts the correct answer first gets the points for that question. It worked out really well. And the students ended up like cheering each other on. And lucky for me, everyone sort of hung in there with the game because everyone got some points. So everyone felt like there was no runaway person who just racked up insane amount of points. So if you can make it fun, students seem to really latch onto that and they seem to really enjoy it. So it's a way to sort of up the interactivity for a session or two. Okay, Aaron, anything else to add for this slide?
No, I think we can move on. Does anyone have any questions?
He's counting off in his head. Okay, 10 seconds. So thinking then, shifting gears from the interactivity in the classroom, we also wanted to talk specifically about how you build connections with students. And we think this applies both for semester-long courses, for embedded librarians who might be working with specific classes and specific professors, or even if you're just sort of popping in for an intense sort of research session once or twice a semester. But the idea here is, how do you actually get to know your students? in the sort of classic physical classroom setting, and how does that change when you move over to the fully remote environment? So I've put some question prompts here just to get you thinking. If you don't want to participate, that's fine, but just think to yourself, what are some of the things that you do and to sort of foster that connection building with your students? And we have here, how effective were research appointments? We also kind of originally put here office hours, because we do offer office hours and we always have. And I didn't get very heavy usage of my office hours, sort of pre-COVID times. I always offered them at a set time or by appointment, and students just didn't tend to take me up on the offer. Very different in the Zoom environment. Did you ever learn about your students' interests, hobbies, career goals, etc.? I would say that I did through informal surveys kind of at the beginning of the semester, but after that, it was just a matter of if the students sought me out and talked to me after class, or if they came to if they did come to office hours and were able to talk, I got to know those students a lot better than sort of the group writ large. And uptick in research appointment requests. So we'd be interested to know what's going on at other libraries, because we have found that we're just literally inundated with requests at the law library, both from our students in advanced legal research, but just sort of on a regular basis now. If students are researching an issue for any class and they have questions, it's sort of like they feel very comfortable reaching out to the library for a Zoom appointment time. So I found that really fascinating, that our numbers have just really gone up in terms of the number of research appointments we're doing. But Aaron, you have anything to add?
I think we are very similar in this regard. In the physical classroom, I would kind of, say, obviously in the first class, going over the syllabus, here are my office hours, here's the set time. I would say, almost every class, please don't be afraid, please come to my office hours. In one class, I took the students on a physical field trip down the hall to my office to show them the door, just to make sure they knew where it was. These were scheduled times, but for drop-in office hours, we required physical office hours meetings, and there was never anything close to the level of engagement that I had this past semester on Zoom. But these meetings are good for pedagogical purposes, but also for learning more about what students want to get out of the class, where they're seeing themselves going in their career. Right, we're a professional school, so I feel like that's all on the table. And I guess I'd be curious to see. It looks like there's
seeing some comments. So Dana says that they saw an uptick as well in the fall. A lot fewer Zoom requests this spring, a lot more emailed questions.
Huh.
Yeah, Dana, you might be totally right about that. That I think there is now, we're getting like a level of burnout with Zoom that it was still semi new in the fall. We did have that spring kind of like abrupt shift. But I think there is something to that, where students are probably really starting to just get tired of this environment. And I can't blame them. Let's see. And Aaron also noted that they saw an uptick in Zoom appointments, but how much of that would have been handled via drop-ins in non-pandemic times?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I will say what we have noticed in the reference department at the law library is that students from outside the law school have requested appointments with us much more frequently. So if there's any kind of grad student or undergrad student and they're working on a legal topic, they can ask for research appointment times with a law librarian, and we'll sort of walk them through the sources they need to think about and where they can go to access those sources. We usually do a handful of those, and students actually had to physically walk over to the law school, which was a trek from most places on campus. So by the time they got there, they'd be all hot and sweaty because it's, North Carolina, and it's hot for most of the fall semester. But what I did notice kind of shifting to Zoom is that word sort of got around that they could now do Zoom appointments. And I have done, just myself personally more in the fall semester than probably like in the past couple of years combined for non-law students. So in our minds, from reference, we think Zoom appointments are going to stick around just because of sort of ease of access for students all across the campus.
Well, and certainly, I think obviously both Melissa and I are reference librarians as well. We do a lot of instruction that way. I found it somewhat easier to demonstrate finding resources through Zoom rather than doing the old librarian turning of the computer screen to demonstrate something. I considered, I don't know. I think there's something to both in terms of building a connection with the students. But on Zoom, I felt that there was less of a barrier to students. And again, I don't know if it's because of the global pandemic, the isolated conditions that many students were under, the novelty of using Zoom. But I think there was something about being able to kind of pop in, know that they did not have to physically go somewhere, knock on the door, enter. I'd be sitting at my desk, and I feel like there was a little bit less friction there.
Yeah, I think that's right. So just on this next slide is where we kind of highlight some of what we've already been talking about in chat. But we have noticed increased use of office hours, significant uptick. And what we actually did in advanced legal research for the first, it was at least my first semester intentionally sort of implementing this, but required research appointments for the students that sort of staggered based on their graded assignments. So in my class, there were 3 big graded assignments, and I required a pre and post conference with me for the first assignment so that students knew what I expected. I showed them what a rubric looked like for the graded assignment. And then after the fact, we talked about how they did and what they could do to improve and where they did really well. And I thought that was going to be the end of it. Like, great, I've met with everybody. Like, I got to know them a bit better. But basically what ended up happening, which was awesome, is that they requested appointments for every other graded assignment throughout the semester. And even if they just had like questions about topics, it sort of just opened the doors, and they just felt really comfortable saying, can I just have a research appointment time? Can I meet with you? So I didn't have like fixed office hours for class, but I was just constantly in Zoom appointments with students throughout the semester. So I think, like Aaron was saying, and like we're all saying, there's just the ease of use, the ability to share screen, to show them sort of what you're looking at without having to flip your computer around. It just really helps. And then sort of this last point we have here about listening to student feedback. Students would, and I sort of told them, like, please, throughout the semester, let me know if something's going really well, or if you're struggling with something, if something's not working, so I can make a change. And students did give me feedback. In our sort of research appointment times, they'd say, oh, and I really liked the way you did this, or can you please make us do more of this? I need more practice. So it allowed me to sort of roll their feedback in sort of into the semester and update and change things as needed. So I did feel like there was an easier sort of feedback loop going on that helped me make the class better for everyone overall.
Yeah.
And Aaron, you're nodding your head.
No,
I think you found the same thing.
I think that's a great transition too, because I found that not only from reading the pedagogy literature, but from real life observation of students, they really love 2 things, right? Clear expectations at the outset, and then if something's not working, that you've listened to them and attempted to change it, even if it's not perfect. You've made some kind of adjustment. Oh, I think this is a really great point in the chat here.
I was going to say, Dana's like, this is exactly right.
Office hours does feel a little vague, whereas making a research appointment is purposeful. We know what we're going to work on while we're there. That's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that was exactly right. So I'm going to, since we're kind of segueing into the last topic, so setting course expectations or setting expectations for any kind of sort of research session that you're going to teach to a larger group. In thinking about how we did it in the past, did you ever request syllabi from professors? Did you request sort of material on sort of where your session fit within the larger scope of things? And how did you set expectations for students when you got there? How will you conduct the class? What kind of participation is expected? In the physical setting, this was all sort of done by word of mouth. I would just sort of tell students, like, here's the general structure, and then we would just do it, and they would get used to the flow of things. But in the Zoom setting, I felt like they were already stressed out to begin with, and I at least would have appreciated clear expectations and guidance. So Aaron and I are going to talk here in a second about how we sort of facilitated that for students. We actually both created a document separate from our syllabus that was literally just what to expect in remote ALR. And it went through all the work products, how they would be handled, where they would be turned in, what the professor was responsible for, what the students were responsible for in return, with the hope that we would just cut back on some of the things that they would have otherwise naturally just picked up over the course of the semester. Like, we just sort of put it out there in clear terms right on day one, so that students kind of came in knowing like what to expect in terms of workload.
Sure.
Aaron?
Yeah, and I'll begin by having a confession, which is that I always just kind of took the syllabus, said the syllabus is kind of like our working contract for the semester. Substitute in the name of the semester, read it over, make sure all the language was right, publicize it for the students, and then kind of leave it alone. The process of preparing for an all remote class is substantively different than the physical classroom. And coming up with a one-page document about what to expect in our remote class sessions, I think was as important for me as it was for the students, because I had to sit back and say, all right, I've been doing this for 6 years now. What exactly am I doing in these class sessions? What is it that I want from the students? And what is it that I'm going to do in this new environment? I'm one of the people who has to kind of start writing to know what I think. And just the act of creating this kind of document put me more in touch with what I kind of saw as my own strengths and weaknesses with regard to the class, and allowed me to become very clear in my own head about what we would be doing.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And one of the things, and that tends to come up with ALR, is that students are surprised by the amount of work that's involved in the class. We hear this every semester where they're like, I didn't realize like it was going to be so much work. That's just sort of like par for the course for this class. But what I found happened this semester is, because I went through that sort of exercise of plotting everything out in sort of very minute detail for students, I didn't get anyone saying like, it was a lot of work. I didn't know it was going to be so much work. And I think that's because I did a much better job in the remote environment of just setting course expectations right at the front end. And that sort of smoothed the way throughout the rest of the semester. Nobody was surprised by any one thing that I was doing in class. And one of the other things to sort of think about is, I just want to sort of, before we go to key takeaways, just think for a second about changing expectations as well, because we did kind of get feedback throughout the semester about how things were going and what was working and what needed some tweaking. So we set expectations, but then we also remained flexible, or tried to be as flexible as we could, to sort of shift gears if students weren't getting what they needed. And really, once we did that, it was a matter of sort of restating course expectations. Just be like, folks, everyone has sort of, sorry about that. Everyone has been saying that they'd like more of this, or they want to spend more time on this topic. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And here's how it's going to change like our course schedule. And then I'd update all the documents and reissue new documents so that students could get to them easily. So it's a lot about setting course expectations at the beginning, but then recognizing that you just have to be ready to change things if something's not working. felt the same way too, right?
Yeah, well, and I shared this with you earlier, Melissa. I think the most gratifying thing about getting my course evals back this semester was that all of the student criticisms were about all of the things that they normally criticize me for in the physical environment. I thought that was a great success. Professor Kirschenfeld is a little too rambling and long-winded in his lectures. Professor Kirschenfeld's assignments are too hard. It's like, great. These are the things that students always complain about.
You would normally be concerned about, yeah.
Right. So there was nothing about the remote environment per se that really seemed to bug them. And making it that seamless, I guess, was really important to me and really gratifying.
Yeah, and I'll say the same thing. And we just sort of have our summary points here at the end. But on this last point with interpersonal connections, because I had so many regular individualized research appointments and conferences throughout the semester, I really felt like I knew the students pretty well by that point. I knew their interests, I knew their career goals, I knew sort of where they were really great at legal research and where they were still kind of working and sort of struggling. And I feel like that sort of translated to them as well, because I did get on my student evals comments that they felt like I was the professor they could go to for a letter of rec because I actually knew them. So it just really it just felt good for me to know that they felt like I knew they were in the class. I got to know them personally, and I was happy that they were there. So all of these little things that we did throughout the semester, well, they don't always feel like they're making a big impact at the moment. They do. And I think students really appreciate them. Yep. Aaron, did you want to add anything?
No. Other than, yes, I've actually noticed that I've gotten more letter of rec requests in the last couple of months than I ever do after a class.
Yeah.
But we've got about 5 minutes left. We'll sit back. There's plenty we've got to talk about, but we're interested in hearing from you.
Yeah. So please, comments, thoughts, what y'all are doing in your libraries. We're just really interested to hear. And I have to apologize for the background noise. There's stuff going on at my house today, and it's just, Zoom live. So I'm looking back through the chat just to make sure we didn't miss anything. Well, I guess in the last few minutes while we're waiting to see if anyone is brave enough to unmute themselves, Aaron, is there anything you did that you wouldn't do again? Basically, if you had to do this remote environment setting again, what was the thing that you felt didn't work?
Fewer. Oh no! Someone said
people are trying to unmute. Oh, here we go. Chat. Okay. Do you all also teach more of the one-shot library sessions where you don't get to know the students? How did these strategies work in that setting? So that's a really good question. So for the one-shots, I think we are a little bit fortunate because we do serve a smaller population. So because the students study in our law library, they take our class, we see them pretty frequently. We also have students that are on journals here at the law school, and so they come to us for journal help as well. I think we tend to build connections with the law students a little bit easier because of that. So when we do go into these one-off sessions, odds are we know at least a handful of the students that are in the class. But Aaron, do you think, you can't poll them, but I think you can still sort of encourage them to chat and interact.
I think as with most things, if I'm going to do a one-off session, I do try to set expectations up front. To me, that's kind of the big one. Say, here's what I can do, here's what I can't do, making sure to share my contact information and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a big one. I always tell students, you can come for a research appointment and we can talk specifically about your project or whatever it is that you're researching. So I do think that helps. And I've done this a little bit with Zoom. I don't know I know there are software technologies that we can use to transition this to the physical environment, but I have done polls throughout my one-off sessions. I think it's helpful because it lets me know that they're still there, like they're actively participating. You just know how many are in the room, and then you can sort of see poll response. But it also sort of helps me to track and make sure they're picking up pieces of content knowledge throughout the session that they need to pick up as we go. And I can sort of re-clarify, re-explain things if the poll answers are completely off base. So that is one tool that I think can be used. Well, you're not getting to know them necessarily. You're at least like ensuring that they're there, they're interacting, they're following the content that you're teaching. So yeah, it's a little bit harder, I'd say, with the one-off sessions, but still there are ways, especially in the Zoom environment, I think, to make sure that they're actively with you for that session. Thanks, Dana. Dana and I were both on the CLUE committee, the Wilson Library CLUE committee.
Well, I see we're at time, but I know I'll be hanging out if this room will be open.
We can leave the room open for the next 5 minutes or so if y'all want to hang out. If anybody wants to ask questions, not in front of 30 people, if you want to. What Aaron was saying about the hello, my dudes, he's the young guy that fits in with everyone, right? You could certainly, we can hang out here. And then at the end of that, we'll close this session and it's going to be recorded. So these will all be provided after the workshop or after the conference. So thanks everybody for attending today. And if you have any questions, comments, anything else, just let us know. And I hope that everybody enjoys the rest of the day. And thanks again for attending the session. And thanks, Melissa and Aaron, for the presentation. It was great.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.
I didn't even get to talk about breakout rooms.
They're not cool.
They are cool. It's one of our big disagreements.
I know. This is one of our points of contention.
Hear us argue about breakout rooms.
Wait, I want to hear about that. This is Nikki.
Okay.
Hey. Okay, so my background experience comes from, I take classes at UNC, just sort of, I'm working on Spanish language classes. And so there's a lot of breakout rooms in there. And I have just found they're really awkward and uncomfortable, and students get into them and they just sort of sit there. They'll accomplish the task and then they'll just sort of sit there until the professor closes the room. And then I have seen in conferences where folks will say, and now we're going to send y'all into breakout rooms. And the number of participants in the room will suddenly plummet because people are they're piecing out.
Well, hold on.
I want to hear Aaron's because I think I might be on Aaron's side. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I understand.
So part of it for me was obviously setting the expectation up front. I said, no compromising. We're going to do our work, some of our work in breakout rooms. Everyone was assigned the same group for the breakout rooms for the entire semester. Oh. So they got used to being with each other in that group. And my favorite, so this is where we did our in-class exercises and things like that. My favorite trick was kind of teleporting in to the room. Right. They would notice I was there. I would say, hi, do you have any questions? They would say, no, be quiet. And then I would just kind of sit there and observe. And after a while, my background is, before I did all this law stuff, I did documentary filmmaking. And one of the key ways you can get people comfortable on camera is just showing up and disappearing, fly on the wall. So I would just sit there. And after about a minute, they would start talking to each other again. And they would start sharing things in the chat. And I would hear them interacting. And then if there was a question, they would ask me. Right. So I found that just going, hanging out, but also setting the clear expectation up front. I think there was something about keeping the group the same throughout that also helped. And obviously my little disappearing trick that I thought we got a lot better interactivity than I ever have in the physical classroom.
That's cool. I did it with 1Ls, and we always went in with a task. So you had to complete this exercise in Westlaw and then compare it to Alexis or whatever. So, and then I would tell them, I need a report back, and then I would have to pick from your list, like group one, blah, blah, blah. And they would never know who I was going to pick. And then I just did the opposite of Aaron. Like I would go in and just like hop in and be quiet. So it would take them a minute to realize that I was there. So it would be like, I'm just going to look at y'all perfect. And then I'm going to affirm or be like, well, are you sure you want to do that? And, so
Yeah, no, I think that's great.
That. That's good. Yeah.
That was the same context that I used. It was a concrete question, usually the shorter type look it up questions. So,
yeah.
And
we had them really doing a lot of compare contrast. So I think, Melissa, if you don't have them doing a concrete task or they're not, then I feel like it can get on your nerves. But I do like the idea of Aaron having concrete, the same group for the entire course.
I like that too.
So you can
had a lot smaller classes. Like I had 30 kids. So it's just like, and I had a big screen. Like I had one big screen that had everybody's faces on one side, but I still had to scroll through to see other people. So it got a little, I had like three screens going at one time.
And Nikki, you can pre-program in those breakout groups. For the entire semester, which is very helpful.
Yeah, thanks guys. I appreciate it.
It's great to hear from you. Yeah. I miss you. Miss seeing you around. Too.
We'll see. I'll get over there to bug you guys soon.
Okay.
Oh, that'll be great.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, I do like the idea of keeping the groups the same, because I do think a lot of the awkwardness is you have to adjust to like a new working group if you're changing them up constantly.
Yeah. I've heard good arguments on both sides.
I can see both sides. I can see if you get a bad group, then you
or a group where you're not. But then again, more like how you can't control sometimes in the practice environment which team you're going to be put on.
Learn to work with
people.
Yeah.
Right.